and the roads were virtually empty, facilitating relatively quick and efficient deployment of troops and material. No soldier, no matter how punctilious in his or her religious observance, hesitated to take whatever actions were necessary to repel the invaders, including many actions that under normal circumstances would be unthinkable, because they would constitute a blatant violation of Yom Kippur's sanctity. In other words, it was clear to all that the survival of the state and its citizens was of supreme value, not only existentially, but religiously as well, setting aside all of Yom Kippur's religious imperatives. Nothing surprises us about this behavior. We all take it for granted that Judaism places the value of life above the sanctity of Shabbat and festivals. What might indeed surprise us is that for centuries, the opposite was true. It was a given that even when threatened militarily, Jews were expected to give up their lives rather than profane Shabbat. It was only during the late Second Temple period, in the midst of the Maccabean revolt, that a dissenting view was expressed and embraced. Even after the revolt, the issue continued to be debated. It took several centuries before a consensus emerged, allowing any action necessary to ensure individual or national survival on Shabbat and other holy days. The idea that the sanctity of Shabbat should take precedence over preserving human life might seem counterintuitive, but we can understand it better if we consider the centrality of Shabbat to Jewish life. Shabbat observance is the only ritual obligation mentioned in the Ten Commandments. Even before the revelation at Sinai, God commands the Israelites to treat Shabbat as a holy day by not cooking, baking, or gathering manna. The sanctity of Shabbat is emphasized in connection with the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert. Despite the importance of the Mishkan's construction, the obligation to rest on Shabbat takes precedence. Later, at the end of the First Temple period and the beginning of the Second Temple era, Shabbat observance was at the heart of a struggle between the residents of Jerusalem and the religious leaders. Both Jeremiah and Nehemiah speak of commercial activity taking place on Shabbat within Jerusalem's walls. Jeremiah prophesies that the continued violation of Shabbat will result in Jerusalem's destruction by fire. Nehemiah responds to Shabbat violation by closing the city gates before Shabbat every Friday. In light of these positions, we can understand that it was far from obvious to our ancestors that there were any circumstances under which Shabbat observance could be set aside. The initial decision to fight on Shabbat was the result of a crisis faced by the Maccabees and their allies. As guerrilla warriors, they took refuge in a network of caves in the Judean desert. Antiochus's soldiers discovered their location. Knowing that the Jews would not defend themselves if attacked on Shabbat, the Seleucid army chose to launch its offensive on that holy day. As a result, untold numbers of Jewish fighters lost their lives as they remained passive in the face of the Syrian assault. Mattathias, seeing this, concluded that it was not God's will that the Jewish people be decimated because of their devotion to Shabbat. Henceforth, he declared, he and his men would defend themselves against all military threats arising on Shabbat. His view was not uncontested. Looking at passages from the second book of Maccabees, the works of Josephus, and Talmudic teachings, we can trace resistance to Mattathias' dispensation and, at the same time, a gradual broadening of the right to engage in warfare on Shabbat, eventually allowing offensive as well as defensive military action on Shabbat. Mattathias did not claim to have prophetic powers. He did not expect direct divine guidance in making his decisions, so he couldn't know whether or not he was acting in accordance with God's will, by allowing defensive military action on Shabbat. He was left with the burden of deciding the issue based on his own understanding of Torah and the needs of the Jewish people. We might imagine a number of questions crossing Mattathias' mind as he considered the appropriate course of action. When can one consider oneself empowered to modify or set aside tradition? What are legitimate means of doing so? How and when is it possible to see one's innovation as consistent with tradition rather than an act of abandonment or betrayal? How is one to decide whether changing Jewish practice will have positive or negative consequences for future generations? When we study the ancient texts addressing the question of warfare on Shabbat, we find that these questions were taken up by advocates on both sides of the issue. Each side invoked theological and existential concerns, and each side warned of the unintended negative consequences that they believed would result if their adversary's view was adopted. The larger questions raised in the debate about warfare on Shabbat remain relevant in contemporary times. In the mid-20th century, when the conservative movement debated whether to allow congregants to drive to synagogue on Shabbat, Shabbat observance was central to questions of communal identity and sustainability. Would allowing people to drive to services on Shabbat strengthen Jewish life, as proponents of the change hoped, by enabling more participation? Or would it weaken Jewish life, as its opponents feared, by discouraging Jews from living near each other and maintaining a Shabbat community? The majority of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards voted to allow people to drive to Shabbat services, yet the debate continued. Was the process by which the decision was reached, and therefore the decision itself, consistent with halakha and with protocols of halachic decision-making? And, in hindsight, was Jewish communal life strengthened or weakened by the change? More recently, in 2006, after years of debate, the Law Committee issued a responsum allowing gay and lesbian Jews to lead partnered lives in dignity, even if not all sex acts were permitted. This responsum took an approach of working within the parameters of the halachic system, but some members felt it went too far, even quitting the Law Committee in protest, while others felt it didn't go far enough and demanded a wholesale rejection of any prohibitions around homosexuality. Today, the Jewish community faces an even broader existential challenge around intermarriage. Would permitting such marriages constitute an irreparable break with Jewish tradition? Or could it be seen as a legitimate expression of that tradition? Would it help preserve Jewish life in America? Or would it weaken it? Considering a parallel struggle from long ago may help us as we strive to find the right balance between tradition and change.
Okay, so to this, I mean, before I call for comments and questions and what have you, I want to add one story that illustrates the difference between today and when this was a live issue in Jewish community. Some years ago, Rabbi Danny Gordis told the story of when his daughter was a teenager. The Army would sponsor meetings for the parents of girls who were going to be going into the Army, and would, so that parents could ask questions about, whatever issues they might have about, what life would be like in the Army for their daughters. And, one of the young women who was taking questions from these parents was clearly an Orthodox woman. She had the long sleeves get up and the dress down to her ankles and so forth. And a father got up and asked her, are you going to make the girls work on Shabbat? And this young woman looked him right in the eye and she said, of course. Gam ha'oyev oved b'Shabbat. The enemy also works on Shabbat. And, we have to take the conflict as seriously as they do, or they're going to be the ones who win. Okay? So, in our time, it's just, it's taken for granted, in spite of whatever other priorities there were at one time. It's taken for granted that, if the situation calls for it, yes, we make war on Shabbat, because Gam ha'oyev oved b'Shabbat. The enemy also works on Shabbat, right? And it's a matter of survival, right? And so, and that's not one of the things we're willing to die for, even though once upon a time it was, right? So, comments or questions up to here? Yes, Ann. You have to unmute yourself.
What has been the effect over the years in the Reform community? Have they strengthened their position or weakened it by okaying intermarriage?
I have an opinion about that, but I'm not going to express it at this point.
So we don't know.
Since the Reform movement is not a halachic movement, right? In other words, there is nothing in the tradition that holds them back from making changes because they're not consistent with Jewish law. I think that's a whole different structure, and I would rather not get sucked into talking about how they're going to deal with it or how they have dealt with it.
Well, we can't predict what will happen to us by looking at what happened with them.
Well, yeah, I don't think we can, because there have been times when we followed certain liberal trends, and there have been times when we didn't. So, just because the Reform movement did something is not a clear indication that we're going to follow it. As an example of that, it was, I believe, 1983 or so that the Reform movement declared that they would no longer be limited to recognizing Jews as the child of a Jewish mother, right? That, if you were a child of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, if you went through certain identifying rituals, such as, for instance, B'nai Mitzvah, then, you were considered a Jew as far as they was concerned. And there were many people at that time who predicted that conservative Judaism, within 10 years, 20 at the most, would follow that path, right? And that's a phrase that I've heard over many issues over the years. Of course, we did not follow that. We have not made that change. We may deal with the problem a little differently than the Orthodox would, but we certainly haven't changed the rules as the Reform movement did.
Yeah.
Yes, Steve.
I agree with you. I think the answer to that question is very complicated. It's a lot of qualitative and quantitative issues involved in that. And they've been growing in numbers, but they've been taking people away from the conservative movement So is it a short-term phenomenon or longer? We don't really know. But I just wanted to say that I think there's a distortion in the video that we heard before, because there's a major difference between modifying like the pikuach nefesh, between fine-tuning and changing things that have already, the principles that are already in our tradition, and creating new ones. Like driving on Shabbat is not really it wasn't a debate about adjusting a principle. It was trying to change to a different reality on the ground, versus pikuach nefesh, between so many other issues that we deal with, even about kashrut, about things or how do we balance the traditions that we already have between one another.
Okay. Yes, Lou?
I think that with regard to the patrilineal descent issue in the reform movement, it's not so much, the results have not been so much in that generation, but in a couple of generations down the line, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in terms of numbers, appear to be less connected to Judaism than their parents and grandparents. And I don't think that's a result of just accepting patrilineal descent, but those parents not providing proper education, and perhaps the synagogue not providing proper education to the children and grandchildren of them.
Yeah. Liz?
I was going to say we kind of dealt with this now because with services and with Zoom or streaming, people using their computers on Shabbat, because if we're gathering in large groups, there is the potential that more people could get sick, more people could die. And so there was that whole debate about, are Zoom services allowable? Is it a minion? So, I mean, it's happening. It was happening right now, whether to keep people healthy.
Yes. Yes. Other comments, observations, questions? Yes, Daniel.
What I'm trying to do is boil down what the central question is here. And I did a screen print of the 4 questions that the guy in the video asked. It strikes me that what we're trying to do is understand what degree of negative impact to the Jewish people becomes unbearable such that we have to change significantly Torah law. In other words, we're going to violate Shabbat because we don't want to all die. That's pretty clear. But is it clear that if we use Zoom to make a minyan, are we all going to die? Well, that's a lot less of an impact. So to me, this is all about measuring risk. What is the risk to the Jewish people if we do or do not make a change?
Mm-hmm.
Am I understanding that is the question? Measuring?
That is a question, certainly, Daniel. And of course, also, just dealing with the current issue, there may be times when you deal with an issue with a temporary measure and skirt the issue of, is this okay once and for all, right? So I might say, if I were the rabbi of a congregation, I might say, well, perfectly okay under these circumstances to have Zoom services, to have people participate in live stream services, et cetera, and not just people who are ill and not able to come to the synagogue, as we formerly promoted participation in services, right? It's another thing to say that that's acceptable once and for all, right? And I think it remains to be seen how that's going to shake out. Yes, Ann.
He raised another question, though. The question of having the service is one thing, but the question of counting it as a minyan and allowing people to say Kaddish from
Yeah.
home when they're
Yeah.
not present at the
See,
minyan.
that is
There's
a
another
separate
question.
and maybe a more technical halakhic question. So I'm going to try and avoid that right now.
But
Because
it's an
I'm
important
not
distinction.
prepared to spend the rest of this morning session just dealing with that one. But yes, that's a legitimate halakhic issue, right? So now let's go to our texts, and we've got to, I have to make a quick change here. So let's pull this up, and now that's not working. Okay. Okay, here we are. So just so you have it in front of you right at the beginning, the first set of the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, right? This is what we're looking at, and this is what our ancestors looked at. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you labor and do all your malacha, your work, whatever that means. That's not well defined here. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle. The cattle love having the day off, by the way. I'm told that's a big thing. Or the stranger who was within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. All right. So there's a broad range of possibilities as to how we decide what falls under this prohibition, right? Because it says 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, right? But it doesn't define work, right? That is fleshed out in the rabbinic tradition, right? So now all it says is there is a cessation of work on the part of the entire household. Okay.
It doesn't say about the wife.
I was thinking the same thing.
You know, it's written ata, it's written you, masculine, but it
Yes.
doesn't say your spouse or anything. And we all know spouses work very hard on Shabbat.
Well, this spouse does, but I think that once the rabbis defined malacha, they defined malacha as applying to everyone in the household, whether husband or wife or anyone else, right? So, if, for instance, if you define, let's say, the act of writing or the act of cooking or an occupation for which one is paid, right? It's pretty clear that the tradition does not regard the wife as an exception just because she's not directly mentioned here. Okay. Yes, Ann.
That they don't prohibit childcare or elder care or a whole lot of other activities that are not considered work, which is work. At least it is difficult and occupies the wife and mother for a lot of the day.
So there are a lot of things that
So that they have to do a regular work anyway.
There may be certain things which are called malacha, but there are exceptions to them, either because of, pikuach nefesh, say, a need to save a life, or because of issues of personal health, right? And so, I think, we have issues like that at 7 acres, right? So, there are people who are on the staff of 7 acres, which is indubitably a Jewish institution and presumably operates according to Jewish law. And yet, there are certain things that happen on Shabbat which are just, accepted either because of pikuach nefesh or as a matter of individual health.
That
There
wasn't,
are other issues that, one could argue that they're not halakhically acceptable under any circumstances, but I won't go into those.
Stephen was bringing up another thing altogether, that housewives do all the time, all day on Shabbat.
Well, but maybe some of those things are not defined as malacha,
That's the problem.
and they're not defined as malacha for men either.
Yes, but they're
Right?
the things that women do. The things that women do are not defined as malacha.
Okay, so then maybe the solution is not to say that they're prohibited, but to say that you need to define the household obligations a little differently so that Shabbat doesn't become an undue burden on the women of the household. Okay?
Rabbi,
Yes.
so according to what you just read, you should not do work. Where did the idea of fire, when did that start?
So fire is a separate prohibition in the Torah. It is eventually, by the rabbis, it is classified as malacha, but there's a separate prohibition specifically. It says, "Lo tavaru eish b'chol moshvotechem." You shall not light a fire in all your habitations on the Shabbat. Okay, and that's at the very beginning of Parshat Vayakhel in the book of Exodus.
Okay, but originally it was just you shall not do work. Other things
Well,
were.
that's the thing. I don't know which one is original, right? Right?
Okay.
It's all in the Torah, and the rabbis say, "Ein mukdamu meuchar b'Torah." Right? There is no earlier or later in the Torah.
Okay.
So don't try to fudge and say, "With this one is the original and that one doesn't matter." Right? They all matter. And so this is just the text in the 10 Commandments. The fact that there are other specific Shabbat prohibitions doesn't mean that they're, not an important part of Shabbat observance. Okay? And here's another piece. Let's look at number 2, right? Mark that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. This is already, with the giving of the manna, and that's before they come to Mount Sinai. God has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you 2 days' food on the 6th day. Let everyone remain where he is. Let no one leave his place on the 7th day. Okay, now let me ask a question at this point. How is this relevant to the question of warfare on Shabbat?
Can't leave your place. You can't go fight.
Yes.
Took it away. We can't look at it.
Yeah, Gordon?
Well, I think I have another question, which I'll ask in a minute. I think warfare is obviously an exception to that rule. It should be.
So yes, it is an exception, but it wasn't recognized as such originally. Right? As
So
we'll
it's allowed to be
see,
done.
we'll see in the text that we're going to come to that became an exception in the time of the Maccabean Wars.
Let me ask, if I may,
Please.
how do you reconcile the prohibition against work by anyone to the concept of having a Shabbos Goy?
Okay, that's a good question. That also became an exception over time, right? One of the priorities in Judaism relating to Shabbat was the idea that Shabbat would be an oneg. It would be a day of pleasure rather than a day of misery. And in fact, you know that the Karaite sect, which took a much more literal, non-rabbinic understanding of the biblical text, said, well, the Torah says you shall not light a fire in your habitations on the Shabbat, right? So they observed Shabbat in the dark and the cold, right? This became rather unpopular, right? And so, that's why the rabbis actually made it mandatory to light candles before the beginning of Shabbat. That's not, something that was mandated in the Torah. That became mandated later as a way of saying, we have to have light and heat in our habitations on Shabbat. Otherwise, it won't be Oneg Shabbat, right? And so for certain exceptional situations, the concept of the Shabbos Goy, of having a non-Jew perform certain labors for us, was occasionally used. Sometimes we would say overused, but occasionally used as a way of making sure that the day wouldn't become burdensome for our families.
Strikes me that what's good enough for a non-Jew should be good enough for me. If the purpose is to have a pleasant day on Shabbos, then it strikes me that a Jew should be able to do for himself what it takes to get that done,
right,
instead of having someone who's not Jewish come in and do it for you.
Yeah, I understand that, Gordon. The problem with that is you're dealing with a specific prohibition that only applies to Jews.
It doesn't say only Jews, it says whoever's in the settlement.
Well,
be a non-Jew.
yes, but for our purposes today, since we don't have, I don't know about you. In our household, we don't have any non-Jewish servants. You have any servants in your home, Gordon? Probably not.
No.
Yeah. So, those prohibitions only apply to us, and in our time, and that's why the implementation of the Shabbos Goy became a way to avoid some of the problems while maintaining the halachic prohibitions that were related to the Shabbat. Let me go on to the next text, and let's see this piece from Deuteronomy. All right, so this talks about what happens when you're fighting a war, right? And it talks about the exceptions. Every male within a certain age group is supposed to be willing to fight in the war, is indeed obligated to take up arms, but there are exceptions listed, right? And all of this is from Parshat Shoftim. Say, when you take the field against your enemies, etc., have no fear, then the Lord your God is with you. Before you join battle, the Kohen will address the troops and, give them a little pep talk here. Let not your courage falter. Do not be in dread of them. God marches with you to do battle for you against your enemy to bring you victory, right? And then they ask a few questions. Okay? The questions are, has anyone built a new house but has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another dedicate it. Is there anyone who has planted a vineyard but has not yet harvested it? Let him go back, lest he die in battle and another harvest it. Is there anyone who has paid the bride price for a wife. In other words, become betrothed to be married, but has not yet married her. Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another marry her. And then here's the last kicker. Is there anyone afraid? Me? No, I'm not afraid. I'm terrified, right? But not afraid. Let him go back to his home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his. Right? So there are, a few exceptions that are built into the system. Right? But those are the only exceptions that are listed. Right? So what's the expectation of the people? The expectation is they're going to take up arms, even though it is acknowledged that they might die in battle. And if you're not one of those groups in the exception, then you have to be willing to go. Okay? Yes, Ronnie. Unmute yourself, Ronnie.
Yeah, no, it's Jerry, yes.
Okay, so
Go ahead, Jerry.
in Israel, the Orthodox made a deal with the government that they would not join the army because they wanted to study, right? There's nothing in that partial part there that talks about that.
No,
So
there
that is
isn't.
not, right?
Right. And therefore, let's look at what that was all about in its origins. At the beginning of the state of Israel, and of course, Ben-Gurion was the prime minister in those early years. And so people came to him from the Haredi world, and they said, our Torah scholars were decimated during the Holocaust, right? Let's set up a system whereby the state supports a pittance, a few hundred Torah scholars, so that we can replenish the supply in the years ahead. Ben-Gurion, not exactly known for having a lot of Rahmanas in his personal style, but here he said, you're right. We'll support that. We'll go along with that. Of course, Ben-Gurion didn't understand that years later we'd be talking about the government and the people of Israel supporting tens of thousands of people to sit and study Torah. Most of them are not necessarily scholars in the way we think of that in the world of Torah, right? And so that was something that has come back to bite the state of Israel, and it's in the process of being resolved. They still have a ways to go. There are units of Haredim within the army now, right?
What are Haredim?
I'm sorry?
What are Haredim?
Haredim meaning the ultra-Orthodox. The word Haredi means those who tremble, meaning those who have a special level of awe of God. At least that's the sense of it. In reality, Haredim is just a term that everybody uses to identify the ultra-Orthodox segment of our society. Okay? So, those, so that's certainly not one of the exceptions that is listed in Scripture. And over time, it's going to be eliminated in practice in Israel as well. It's one of those things that is definitely going to take time. And I think that even the leadership in the Haredi community recognizes that. Yes, Gordon.
I know that women serve in the army in Israel.
Yes.
Are they drafted or do they volunteer?
Well, they are drafted, but women have an option for national service as opposed to military service. So
Does
they,
that
again,
apply?
so, most of the Haredi women, for instance, not necessarily, other Orthodox Jews, but most of the Haredim, those women do go into national service.
What's the rule about the ultra-Orthodox women?
Well, there isn't a rule. The same rules apply to their women as to every other woman in Israel, meaning that they have the option to choose national service.
Okay.
And some of the non-Haredim certainly do that as well.
But do they get paid if they want to study?
Oh, no, that's a whole nother thing. That's just for the men.
Right.
Sorry. No, we don't have Haredi women sitting and studying Torah. And that's not happening. Okay, we are just about out of time for today. We'll pick up on this next week. If you have any questions, store them until next Sunday morning, okay?
Special Hanukkah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Rabbi.
Happy
Right,
Hanukkah,
and the rest,
everybody.
those of you who are coming back to the 11 o'clock class, I'll see you in about 5.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for those who asked questions.